Today is September the 11th, 2018. I'm Allison Dorsey. This is Allie's Super Short Show. Thank you so much for watching and welcome back to the channel. As we all know, September the 11th, 2001 was the darkest day in living American history. 2,996 people were killed and over 6,000 others were injured when 4 passenger airplanes departed from 3 airports and were later hijacked by 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists. One plane was initially flown towards Washington, D.C., but its passengers heroically stopped the hijackers, and instead they flew into a field in Stony Creek Township of Pennsylvania. A second plane was crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington County, Virginia. The last 2 planes were crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. 9/11 was the single deadliest incident for firefighters and law enforcement officers in the history of the United States. To explain the geopolitical reasons for the tragic events of that day, we have to go back in time to the Cold War. After World War II, Russia still had designs on expanding its empire or at least spreading communism, and the resource-rich Middle East was the perfect place to grow. During the tail end of the Cold War, while tensions were high between the US and the Soviet Union became allies of some of the Arab states and encouraged conflicts between them and their Jewish neighbors. Increased Soviet favoritism towards Iraq and Syria pushed the former allies, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, away from Russian influence. The Soviets attempted to convince the Arab states to join their sphere of influence, though the Arab League kept closer ties between religious allies than economic allies. Afghanistan had been unstable for decades, with rival armed groups fighting for control of the country. The Soviet Union decided to take advantage of this to attempt to install a communist government of their own design. In 1979, the Soviet Union deployed tens of thousands of troops to bolster pro-communist governments in Afghanistan, but the conflict left 15,000 Soviet soldiers dead, forcing them to eventually withdraw 9 years later. This severely reduced their popularity and credibility in the Arab world. Before the retreat, the Soviet troops were able to set up a regime in the Afghan capital of Kabul called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA. The US, with its own designs on trying to spread freedom and democracy, couldn't let this stand. To counter Soviet influence, the US began Operation Cyclone under President Jimmy Carter and continued under President Ronald Reagan. The US began supplying money, weapons, and training to the Mujahideen, who were the guerrilla group of jihadists resisting the Soviet occupation. The US was not alone in their support. Pakistan, China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia also offered to support the Mujahideen. Operation Cyclone was one of the longest and most expensive covert CIA operations ever undertaken. Funding began with just over $500,000 in 1979 and increased exponentially to $63 million per year by 1987. Funding continued well after 1989 as the Mujahideen battled the Soviet-installed government during the Afghan Civil War, which raged between 1989 until 1992. So to clarify, the US armed troops in Afghanistan and set them to fight other Afghan troops who were armed by the Russians, and we called it all a civil war. Around the same time, Osama bin Laden and followers splintered off from the Mujahideen to become Al-Qaeda, which has been designated as a terrorist group by the United Nations Security Council, NATO, the EU, the United States, and many other countries. In 1992, ending the Afghan Civil War, the Mujahideen forces removed the Soviet-backed government. Unfortunately, this left a power vacuum. The next year, many of the different factions of Afghans managed to agree on the formation of a single government, but infighting continued regardless. By 1994, with the capital city of Kabul in rubble, Mullah Muhammad Omar, a Muslim cleric, formed the Taliban movement of Islamic students. They took up arms with the United States backing and were able to capture the city of Kandahar and march to take back what was left of Kabul. While the Taliban was mostly a nationalistic movement and fundamentally committed to building an Islamist state in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda envisions the removal of foreign influence from the Muslim countries and a creation of a new ruler to reign over the entire Muslim world through any means necessary. Mullah Omar, the Taliban's founder, even publicly opposed the international activities of Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda's founder. Around the same time, the Northern Alliance is formed from the rubble of the PDPA. They received support from Russia, Iran, Turkey, India, and others. So again, to clarify, the US armed the Taliban in Afghanistan to fight the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, who were armed by the Russians, and they fought each other for the control of Afghanistan. By 1996, Afghanistan became so divided that it only took 2 years for the Taliban to coalesce and seize control of the country, where they were able to overtake Kabul and publicly execute the former president. This is not the end of the fighting, however, as in 1998, Al-Qaeda attacks the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Immediately, the US launches missiles at suspected Osama bin Laden bases in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, and then the US puts Osama bin Laden on the FBI's most wanted list. This also has the effect of turning the Taliban's opinion of the US from good to sour. In 1999, a peace agreement is reached between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance, but fighting broke out again just a few months later. Also this year, the UN imposes some embargoes on the Taliban in an attempt to force them to hand over Osama bin Laden, who is suspected of hiding somewhere in the hills of Afghanistan. A lot of things happen in 2001 leading up to the attacks on September 11th. The UN places more embargoes on Afghanistan, which further diminish the relationship between the Taliban and the US. The US finally stops funding and sending weapons to the Taliban. Attempting to enforce their religious law, the Taliban destroys ancient Buddhist statues, forces people of other religions to wear identifying tags, and requires non-Muslim women to wear hijabs and veils. They even go as far as to ban the internet, playing cards, chessboards, musical instruments, and more, claiming that they're against Islamic law. September 9th, a Northern Alliance commander is wounded in an Al-Qaeda suicide attack and dies several days later. And finally, on September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacks the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and the US invades Afghanistan. The world was forever changed that day. Maybe this all could have been avoided, or possibly not. Maybe if the tensions between Russia and the US ended in total war, we would be in a nuclear winter right now. I don't know. What I do know is that fighting proxy wars is wrong and devastating to the people who live there. These proxy wars caused ripples throughout the entire world. In trying to thwart the Soviet Union, we helped create the animosity that caused the attacks on September 11, 2001. Never forget. Alright guys, I know that was a difficult one to get through, but thank you for watching. Again, I'm Allison Dorsey. This is Allie's Super Short Show, and I'll see you guys on Thursday. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.